"You're nothing but an embarrassment to me." The words cut deeper than any blade, spoken in front of strangers, leaving a scar that no amount of time could hide. Sometimes betrayal doesn't come from enemies. It comes from the very people we expect to protect us. And when that betrayal is made public, it doesn't just wound the heart, it shakes the foundation of dignity itself. Before we dive into today's story, I recommend you hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy this video, type 1 in the comments. If not, type 0 to let me know how I can make better content for you. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink, because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. I have always been a man of wood and sweat, not of silk and chandeliers. My name is David Lawson, and at 58, my body carries the evidence of the years. An ache in my back from hours bent over lumber, a belly softened by medication and age, and hands rough enough to remind me where I belong. I run a modest carpentry shop in Santa Rosa, California, the kind of place where sawdust settles on your clothes and the air smells faintly of pine and varnish. My late wife used to say those smells were the perfume of honest work. She's been gone for over a decade now, and in her absence I raised our only child, Ethan, as best as I could. I did what fathers are supposed to do, though not always gracefully. I paid the tuition bills that came in thick envelopes, I fronted the deposit on his first apartment, and when he wanted to start a small marketing side project, I lent him more than I could afford. I never asked for repayment. To me, a father's support wasn't a loan, it was a rope you threw to your kid and prayed he would climb. Ethan climbed, in his own way. He found his career in the city, and now he was marrying Avery Whitaker, daughter of the Whitaker family, who owned a sprawling distribution business tied to California wine. They had money, connections, and a name that carried weight at country clubs. I had a workshop and calloused palms. The wedding was set at Sterling Ridge Winery, a place where rolling vineyards stretched out like green velvet, and the sunlight turned the rows of grapes into rivers of gold. Everything about it radiated wealth and permanence. The Whitakers hosted the event as if they were staging a performance, every detail rehearsed, every glass polished. When I stepped into that world, dressed in the only suit I owned, a dark blue number bought on sale, and tailored just enough to hide my stomach, I knew I was an extra in a play where everyone else had speaking lines. I polished my shoes until the leather almost shone. On my wrist, I wore the only piece of jewelry that mattered, my father's old watch, scratched but steady, ticking away in its quiet rhythm. It was a reminder that I came from men who worked with their hands, men who measured worth not in the price of wine, but in the weight of what they carried. When I arrived, I noticed the way the Whitaker relatives looked at me, smiles polite, but eyes doing their arithmetic. They saw the suit that didn't quite belong, the shoulders that slouched from years of lifting more than they should, the hair that grayed unevenly. I'd seen those looks before in hardware stores and bank lobbies, the look that said, "You are useful, but you are not one of us." I told myself it didn't matter. This day was for Ethan, and my job was to keep my head up, smile at the right times, and stay out of the way. Still, the undercurrent was hard to ignore. Avery's family moved through the winery with the ease of people who had grown up in banquet halls. Their laughter carried without strain. Their clothes fit like second skin. Ethan blended in effortlessly beside them, his tailored suit crisp, his smile confident. I caught his glance once across the courtyard, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation, almost embarrassment, but it vanished before I could be sure. I took my seat near the front, where the planners had placed me for the sake of photographs. The ceremony itself was lovely, rows of white chairs in the vineyard, sunlight softening against the vines. The pastor spoke of roots and endurance, comparing love to vines that cling to rocky soil. It struck me as the truest thing I'd heard all day. My own marriage had been exactly that, clinging to rocky soil until fate tore it loose. After the vows were spoken and the rings exchanged, we moved into the reception hall. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain above us, and the tables gleamed with polished silverware I had to resist picking up to test its balance. The menu was printed in cursive on thick cardstock, listing dishes I couldn't pronounce without stumbling. I kept my head down, content to sip water and watch the flow of the evening. I reminded myself that silence was sometimes the best gift you could give your child. If I didn't say much, no one could twist my words into embarrassment. If I kept my hands folded, no one could call me clumsy. My role was to stand still, to be reliable, the way a beam holds up the roof without asking for notice. But beneath that calm, a knot had begun to tighten in my chest. I knew how fragile these polished nights could be. One careless laugh, one poorly chosen word, could shift the weight of the room. I prayed it wouldn't come from me. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have predicted, was that it would come from my own son. And it wouldn't just be words. It would be a gesture so public, so humiliating, that the stain it left would outlast the red wine itself. If you're still watching and feeling the weight of this story, comment number 1 below so I know you're with me. Let's keep going. The reception had barely begun when I felt the first crack in what should have been a perfect day. I sat at the family table, tucked close to the dance floor, where every move and smile seemed illuminated under chandeliers that glowed like 100 suns. The air was perfumed with roses and oak-aged wine, the kind of luxury that didn't belong to my world. Around me, laughter rose easily, but I couldn't ignore the way some eyes lingered on me, measuring, dissecting, passing judgment as if I were a curiosity in a place I didn't belong. Avery's relatives, polished and poised, leaned toward each other in whispers, just soft enough to seem innocent but sharp enough to reach my ears. I caught fragments of their conversation, the words slicing in their casual cruelty. One asked Ethan, "And what does your father do?" His voice carried the kind of curiosity that wasn't curiosity at all. It was assessment. Ethan shifted in his chair, let out a half-hearted laugh, and replied vaguely, "Oh, he keeps himself busy with work." Nothing more. No mention of the carpentry shop I had spent 30 years building. No pride in the sweat and the tools. No acknowledgement that those calloused hands had paid his tuition. He moved the subject along as if my story were an inconvenience, a detail best left forgotten. I heard it, plain as day, and felt something tighten in my chest. For a moment, I thought he might correct himself, add a word of recognition. But he didn't. He let the silence swallow the truth of who I was. Later, during the toasts, one of Avery's wealthy uncles raised his glass, swirling the deep red liquid like it was his birthright. He smiled in my direction, with a grin that held more edge than warmth. "Not sure if Mr. Lawson here is used to wine of this caliber," he said lightly, his words dripping with irony. "I'd imagine he prefers a cold beer in a garage, right?" The table erupted in laughter, polite and cruel all at once. Their chuckles bounced against the crystal walls of the glassware. I looked to my son, praying he would stop it, praying he would defend me with even a single word. Instead, Ethan chuckled along, a little too quickly, his laughter blending into theirs. He didn't look at me, not once. His silence weighed heavier than the joke itself. I sat there, smiling thinly, though every muscle in my face screamed with shame. The glass in my hand trembled, and I steadied it against the tablecloth. I had endured humiliation before, from strangers, from clients who thought a carpenter wasn't worth respect, but from my own son, on his wedding day, the sting cut deeper than any saw blade I'd ever handled. My chest burned with a mixture of anger and sorrow. I reminded myself that Ethan was nervous. He was surrounded by people whose approval meant something to his new wife and her family. Maybe this was his way of trying to belong. But as I watched him laugh with them, brushing me aside like a blemish on his perfect evening, I couldn't escape the truth. My son was ashamed of me. The music swelled as the band played a jazz number. Guests rose from their seats, the air filling with clinking glasses and polite applause. Yet all I felt was distance. The room seemed to grow larger while my place in it grew smaller, shrinking me into the background like an afterthought. My suit, which I had pressed and prepared with care, suddenly felt cheap against the sparkle of sequined gowns. My shoes, polished until I could see my face in them, felt heavy, as though each step would echo my unworthiness. I tried to focus on the joy of the moment, the way Avery's face glowed as she smiled at Ethan, the pride in her parents' eyes, the celebration of love that was supposed to unite families. But all I could feel was the wedge slowly being driven between mine and my son's. a wedge built of laughter, silence, and shame. The night carried on, but something inside me had shifted. I had walked into that winery ready to be nothing more than a proud father, content to watch my son begin a new chapter. Instead, I was reminded in subtle, piercing ways that in this world of chandeliers and polished silver, I was not only invisible, I was an embarrassment. I clutched my father's old watch beneath the table, running my thumb across its scratched face, searching for steadiness. The rhythm of its ticking anchored me, whispered that worth was not measured by wine lists or pedigrees. But still, a question gnawed at me, relentless and heavy. What happens when your own child, the one you raised and sacrificed for, is the first to laugh at your expense? I didn't know the answer yet. All I knew was that the night was far from over, and humiliation had a way of snowballing. Something told me that what I'd just endured was not the peak of the storm, but only its warning. If you are still watching and the emotions are hitting home, drop a number 2 in the comments. I want to know you're following closely. Let's continue. The hum of the reception had swelled into a comfortable roar. Guests laughed easily now, their voices blending with the jazz trio that played near the stage. The servers moved like shadows, balancing trays of wine and hors d'oeuvres. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe the tension had passed, that I could retreat into the background and let the night finish without further injury. But I was wrong. It started small, as most humiliations do. One of Avery's cousins, a tall man with a voice meant to carry across football fields, repeated the joke from earlier about me drinking garage beer. He raised his glass high, his grin wide, and bellowed, "Better make sure Mr. Lawson can handle the fancy stuff tonight." The table erupted in laughter, sharper and louder this time, emboldened by alcohol and the safety of numbers. My stomach tightened, but I pressed my lips together and said nothing. I looked at Ethan. He was seated at the head table, basking in the attention of friends and family. I hoped, prayed he would shut it down, remind them that I was his father, deserving of at least a shred of respect. Instead, he chuckled, not a nervous chuckle, not an awkward one, a real laugh. And then he leaned forward, glass in hand, and said, "Dad never really belonged in places like this. He's more of a back-of-the-shop kind of guy." The words struck like nails hammered straight into my chest. A chorus of laughter followed, rippling down the table. I sat frozen, my hand tightening around my fork so hard I thought it might snap. My son, my only child, the boy I had raised through scraped knees, schoolyard fights, and long nights of homework, had just turned me into the punchline of his own wedding. Before I could gather myself, before the sting of his words had even settled, the moment escalated. Ethan lifted his wine glass, took a generous sip, and when his eyes met mine across the table, he burst into laughter again. The laughter came with a spray of red wine, the liquid fanning across the space between us. Drops struck my face, warm and sour, staining the collar of my suit and leaving crimson blotches across the fabric I had pressed so carefully. Time froze. The music faltered as if the band had suddenly forgotten their instruments. 100 eyes turned toward me. The laughter that had filled the hall just moments earlier died abruptly, replaced by the kind of silence that crackles with disbelief. I sat there, drenched in my son's wine, feeling it slide down my cheek and soak into my shirt. My throat closed tight, my breath caught. Every humiliation of my life, every cheap joke, every dismissive look, every moment my worth had been questioned, condensed into that one instant. And worst of all, it came from Ethan. I thought of the nights I had stayed up sanding wood long after midnight, just to make enough to cover his tuition. I thought of the loan I had taken out to help him with his first apartment, the pride I felt every time I saw him take another step forward in life. And now, here I was, the spectacle, the fool, the man who had given everything only to be repaid with ridicule in front of strangers. The silence in the room was suffocating. Some guests stared at their plates, unwilling to meet my eyes. Others watched openly, curious to see how the scene would unfold. Avery's parents looked horrified, her mother clutching her pearls as though the air itself had betrayed her. A few friends of Ethan tried to smother their laughs but failed, the sound spilling out like a cruel echo. Ethan dabbed his mouth with a napkin, still grinning. though a flicker of realization crossed his face as he saw the stunned expressions around him. For a brief moment, he looked like the boy I once knew, uncertain, caught in something bigger than himself. But the moment passed, and he shrugged, muttering, "It was just a joke." Just a joke. The same words bullies had used on me in schoolyards, the same words customers had used when mocking my calloused hands at the hardware store, the same words I had swallowed again and again. Now they came from my son. I didn't rise, I didn't shout. I didn't throw my glass in return, though the thought burned hot in my mind. Instead, I sat perfectly still, wine dripping from my chin, my father's old watch ticking steadily at my wrist. It was the only sound that mattered to me in that hollow room. Tick, tick, tick. A reminder that humiliation passes, but the truth remains. My heart pounded as I realized something had shifted. This wasn't simply another cruel moment to endure. This was a line being crossed, a betrayal so public and so raw, it demanded an answer. I could no longer hide behind silence or excuse his behavior as nerves. Ethan had chosen laughter over loyalty, and in doing so, he had lit a fire inside me that I could not put out. I reached for my napkin, wiped my face slowly, and set it down with care. My eyes stayed on Ethan, steady and unblinking, while the room held its breath. I didn't need to speak, not yet. The weight of what had just happened was heavy enough to linger in every corner of the hall. But deep inside, one truth settled clear as stone. This night had only just begun, and it would not end the way my son expected. If you're still watching and these moments strike a chord with you, leave a number 3 below to let me know you're here. Let's carry on. I sat there, drenched in wine and shame, but I refused to let my body tremble. My hand found the napkin beside my plate, and I dabbed slowly at my face, careful and deliberate, as though each movement were an act of defiance. The suit I had pressed so neatly just hours before was now stained crimson, and yet I straightened my shoulders and forced myself to breathe evenly. I would not give them the spectacle of a broken man. The room around me seemed frozen, all eyes drawn to the aftermath of Ethan's outburst. Some guests averted their gazes, embarrassed on my behalf. Others leaned forward, smirking, as though waiting for me to explode and prove I didn't belong. But I would not hand them that satisfaction. My instinct was to protect my son, even from himself. No matter how deep the wound, I would not let anger dictate my actions. Not yet. I caught Ethan's eyes across the table. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw regret flicker in them, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He raised his glass again, grinning toward his friends, brushing off the silence with a forced laugh. My heart ached. I wanted to believe he would realize his mistake, that he would stand and apologize, but instead he turned his back to me, leaning in to whisper to a groomsman as though nothing had happened. Summoning what dignity I could, I lifted my own glass of water and offered a stiff smile in his direction. "To your happiness," I murmured, barely above a whisper, hoping he would see my attempt at peace. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't even glance my way. His friends chuckled softly, their shoulders shaking, as though the joke was still alive and well. My words vanished into the air like smoke. I turned back to the table, determined to salvage something of the evening. One of Avery's uncles, the one with the booming laugh, was cutting into his steak. I forced a polite comment about the vineyard setting, trying to join the conversation. He nodded absently, then immediately shifted his focus back to another guest. It was as if my voice carried no weight, my presence dismissed without thought. I tried again with the woman seated beside me, remarking on the music, but her eyes darted past me before she excused herself to check on the bride. Each attempt was a reminder. I was not part of their world. My words fell flat, unwanted, like nails hammered into the wrong board. I could feel the walls closing in, the polite cruelty of being invisible. It was a quieter kind of humiliation than Ethan's whine, but no less painful. Still, I forced myself to sit tall. My father's watch ticked steadily on my wrist, reminding me that endurance was its own kind of resistance. I thought if I held my ground, if I kept silent and dignified, the tension might ease and the evening could stumble back toward normalcy. But instead, my restraint seemed to embolden them. A glance here, a smirk there. My silence was mistaken for weakness. Ethan laughed again at something whispered in his ear, loud enough for me to hear. He hadn't even tried to repair the damage. His laughter was salt rubbed into an open wound. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, my mind racing. Should I confront him here and now? Should I stand and remind him of the years I had carried him on my back? The sacrifices I had made so he could sit at the head of this lavish table? But no. To lash out in anger would only confirm what they already believed, that I was out of place, uncivilized, incapable of grace. Instead, I tried one final time. I leaned slightly toward Ethan, catching his eye as the laughter died down for a moment. I offered him a small, almost pleading smile, hoping to remind him of the boy who once clutched my hand at baseball games, who once fell asleep on my chest after long days. "Son," I said softly, just loud enough for him to hear, "maybe we can talk later." He gave me nothing. No acknowledgement, no response. He simply turned back to Avery, placing his hand over hers, presenting to the room the perfect image of a polished groom. To him, I was a shadow to be ignored, an embarrassment best erased by pretending I wasn't there. The sting of that rejection was sharper than the wine in my eyes. My efforts to smooth the moment, to salvage some shred of dignity through patience and silence, had failed. I had tried to bridge the gap, and he had left me stranded. I sat back in my chair, a lump in my throat that I swallowed down with water. Around me, the music resumed. The clinking of glasses grew louder, and the evening marched forward as though nothing had happened. But inside, I knew something had shifted. My patience had run its course. Humiliation could only be swallowed for so long before it curdled into resolve. And as the laughter swelled again around me, I realized this wasn't just about embarrassment anymore. This was about dignity, about respect, and about a father who would not allow his own son to strip him bare in front of a room full of strangers. The first attempt had failed, but I would not fail again. If you are still watching and can feel the tension building, type number 4 in the comments, so I know you're walking through this with me. Let's move forward. The evening had reached the part where everything should have felt celebratory. Glasses clinked, music swelled, and guests leaned into their conversations with the warm ease of wine and laughter. Yet at my table, I felt the air tighten like a rope pulled too taut. The earlier humiliation still clung to me, the stain of Ethan's wine visible on my suit like a badge of disgrace. I had done my best to swallow it, to keep quiet and let the night march forward. But humiliation has a way of breeding in silence, growing bolder with every breath you give it. Ethan rose from his chair at the head table, encouraged by the slaps on his back and the grins of his groomsmen. Someone shoved a microphone into his hand, though it wasn't his turn to speak. The planner off to the side waved discreetly, trying to signal him back to his seat, but he ignored her. He was drunk on more than wine. He was drunk on attention. "Just a few words," he said, his smile wide, his voice amplified now for every corner of the hall. The guests cheered, eager for another moment of entertainment. My heart sank. He started with pleasantries, thanking the Whitakers for their generosity, praising Avery for her beauty. The crowd clapped politely. Then he shifted, his eyes scanning until they landed on me. A flicker of mischief crossed his face, and I knew what was coming before the words even formed. "You know," Ethan said, "my old man has always been a character. Waking up before dawn smelling like sweat and sawdust, always covered in oil or wood chips. He's the kind of guy who thinks flannel counts as formal wear." Laughter rippled through the room, soft at first. Ethan leaned into it. "And dinner with him? Let's just say it wasn't steak and wine. More like cold pizza and whatever beer was left in the garage fridge. That's Dad, our family's very own garage man." The laughter erupted louder this time, echoing across the chandeliers. Guests slapped at their tables, some wiping tears from their eyes as if it were the best comedy they'd heard all night. My face burned, but not from shame alone. It was rage pressing against the cage I had built inside me. Ethan raised his glass toward me, the spotlight catching the red liquid as it swirled. "That's my dad," he said, grinning, "always out of place, even tonight." The applause came then, mixed with laughter, a cruel soundtrack that shook me to my core. I felt every eye in the room turn to me again, not with respect or admiration, but with amusement. A father reduced to a punchline at his son's wedding. I gripped the edge of the table so tightly my knuckles whitened. Inside, something broke. All the years of sacrifice, the tuition checks, the nights I went without so he could have more, the quiet pride I carried for him, condensed into a single, unbearable truth. My son was ashamed of me, and he wanted the world to know it. For a moment, I thought I might shout, stand, and let the anger tear free. My pulse thundered in my ears, urging me to unleash every bitter truth I had held back. But I forced myself still. I looked at Ethan, at his smug smile, at the guests who clapped and laughed, as though my life were a stage show for their amusement. And I realized something. This wasn't just about me. This was about dignity, the kind that couldn't be restored by anger. Yet even in my restraint, I knew the line had been crossed. Ethan hadn't simply embarrassed me, he had tried to erase me. The man who raised him, who carried him through life's storms, was now nothing more than a joke in his new world of chandeliers and fine wine. I glanced around the hall. Some faces looked away in discomfort, unwilling to participate but too cowardly to stop it. A handful of others watched me with pity, which somehow stung worse than the laughter. And then there were those who reveled in it, their shoulders shaking with cruel delight. The room had divided itself neatly into three kinds of witnesses: the complicit, the cowardly, and the cruel. In that moment, the anger inside me stopped feeling like a wildfire and started feeling like steel. Cold, sharp, deliberate. A fire burns itself out, but steel endures. I straightened in my chair, lifted my chin, and let my son finish his so-called toast. Every word only cemented the choice I knew I had to make. When he sat down, still grinning, I didn't move, I didn't clap, I didn't give the room the reaction it craved. I simply held his gaze long enough for him to see what he had awakened. The breaking point had come, and though I didn't know yet how, I swore to myself in that silence. Before this night was over, I would reclaim the dignity that was mine, not through anger, not through violence, but through a reckoning so undeniable that Ethan and every guest in that hall would never again mistake silence for weakness. I sat in silence, the laughter from Ethan's speech still echoing in my ears, though the room had begun to settle back into its rhythm of chatter and clinking glasses. My suit clung uncomfortably, the wine stains stiff against my chest, a reminder of how far my son had gone to erase me in front of strangers. Every nerve inside me screamed for action, but I forced myself to breathe, to think. A man cannot undo years of sacrifice in one reckless outburst, but he can reclaim his dignity with the right choice. I remembered nights when Ethan was small, curled against me on the couch, while I told him stories about heroes who fought not with swords, but with character. I remembered scraping together tuition payments, choosing to patch my boots instead of buying new ones, just so he could walk through life with better shoes than mine. And I remembered my wife's last words before the illness took her: "Don't let him forget who you are." Yet, here I was, sitting under chandeliers that belonged to another world, my son laughing at me as though I were nothing but an outdated joke. My patience had been stretched to breaking, but anger alone would not restore what had been lost. This night was not only about me, it was about the measure of a father, about whether silence in the face of disrespect was love or cowardice. I looked around the room carefully. Some guests leaned back, satisfied with the entertainment, whispering as if the evening had regained its lightness. Others avoided my eyes, embarrassed by what they had witnessed, but unwilling to stand against it. A few, very few, watched me with a different kind of gaze, one that held unease, even pity. Their eyes told me what my heart already knew. This was not an ordinary moment. This was a test of who I would choose to be. My hand brushed against my father's old watch. Its steady tick reminded me of everything I came from, of men who built with their hands, who never needed chandeliers to know their worth. That watch had survived longer than pride or shame. It reminded me that respect is not handed out by rooms like this. It is claimed. And so, the choice sharpened itself inside me. I could sit quietly, let the stain dry, and let the room remember me as a man too small to defend himself. Ethan would go home thinking his father was weak, Avery's family would believe their cruel assessment was right, and my silence would confirm it. Or I could rise, not with fury, but with truth. I could remind my son and everyone in this hall that dignity is not for sale, and that the man he mocked tonight is the same man who carried him here. My pulse steadied. I took a sip of water, set the glass down carefully, and leaned back in my chair. Already, I felt the weight of expectation shift. Guests at nearby tables sensed it. They glanced toward me, their conversations faltering, their eyes catching the tension that had not broken but only coiled tighter. The room was waiting, whether it knew it or not. I thought of Ethan, of the boy who once asked me to build him a wooden boat for the creek behind our house, who had beamed with pride when we floated it together. I thought of the man he had become, standing there tonight with polished shoes and cruel laughter, and I knew my choice was not only for me, it was for him too. Because if I stayed silent, I would teach him the worst lesson of all, that disrespect carries no cost. I straightened my back, ignoring the tug of the wine-stiffened fabric. Slowly, deliberately, I rested my palms on the table and drew in a breath. My decision was made. I would speak, not in anger, not to shame him, but to reclaim the space that belonged to me. Not just as Ethan's father, but as a man who had lived and bled and built his life with his own two hands. Around me, the music seemed to falter, the piano player hesitating on a note. Or maybe it was only in my mind. Either way, I knew I was stepping into a moment that would split the night in two, before and after. The chatter dimmed, forks paused midair, and the hum of conversation thinned as eyes began to settle back toward me. I took another deep breath and lifted my gaze to the head table, locking eyes with my son. He laughed still, unaware of what was about to come, but I was ready. My silence had ended. The choice was made. If you're still watching and the turning point is pulling you deeper, write number 6 in the comments so I know you're holding on. Let's keep pushing. When I finally rose from my chair, the room seemed to inhale and hold its breath. The clinking of silverware stopped, the music stumbled to a halt, and every eye turned toward me. My legs felt heavier than they ever had, but each step I took carried a clarity I had not felt in years. I was no longer simply a father at his son's wedding. I was a man who had been publicly shamed, and I would not allow silence to be my legacy. At first, Ethan chuckled. He leaned back in his chair at the head table, microphone still clutched in his hand, and smirked like a boy caught sneaking candy. "Come on, Dad," he said with a nervous laugh that echoed too loud in the microphone. "Don't take it so seriously. It was just a joke." But when his eyes met mine, his grin faltered. I held his gaze without blinking, my jaw set, my back straight. For the first time that evening, he seemed to understand that this wasn't a passing embarrassment. It was something much deeper. His laughter died in his throat, leaving behind an uneasy silence. Around us, the guests shifted in their seats. Some looked down at their plates, unable to meet my eyes. A few of Avery's family members glanced uncomfortably at one another, whispering just loud enough for me to catch fragments. He went too far, not right for a wedding. Others still wore faint smirks, as if waiting for me to stumble and complete the humiliation. The hall had split into two camps, those who recognized cruelty when they saw it, and those who were content to enjoy the spectacle. I could feel the weight of both groups pressing against me. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer force of restraint. 1,000 memories of raising Ethan crashed through my mind. Late nights fixing broken bicycles, driving him to baseball practice before sunrise, working double shifts just so he could attend a college he barely acknowledged. Each memory, once a source of pride, now stung like salt in a wound. The realization hit me hard. Our bond was not just frayed, it had been torn wide open in front of an audience, and Ethan had been the one to wield the knife. I felt the pain of that truth like a weight in my chest. It wasn't just about the wine, the jokes, or the laughter. It was about betrayal. A father gives his life in pieces, silently, every day, never asking for applause. All he wants is a measure of respect, a recognition that his sacrifices mattered. But instead of honor, I was served mockery. And yet, with the pain came something else, resolve. The hush in the room gave me space to breathe, to gather myself. My voice did not rise yet. I simply stood, my presence commanding enough to shift the air. I wanted Ethan and everyone else in that hall to feel the weight of what had been broken. I reached into my pocket and touched the cool metal of my father's old watch. The simple act steadied me. Generations of men had worn it, men who had endured hardship without ever bowing their heads. I realized then that I would not let Ethan's shame define me. If he could not see my worth, I would make sure the world did. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier bravado draining away as whispers began to ripple through the crowd. The guests were no longer simply amused. Now, they were watching a reckoning unfold. Inside me, grief wrestled with determination. I mourned the boy Ethan used to be, the son who once looked up at me with trust and admiration. But that boy was gone, replaced by a man who had chosen vanity and cruelty. I could not bring the boy back. What I could do was decide what came next. And so, even as the laughter faded and the weight of silence pressed in, I knew the night was no longer about humiliation. It was about what I would do with it. My patience had been tested, my love betrayed, and my dignity dragged into the dirt. But in the ashes of that pain, a plan was already forming. I would not lash out recklessly. I would not give in to rage. I would wait. I would gather myself. And when the moment came, I would respond with truth so undeniable that not even Ethan could laugh it away. The humiliation had reached its peak. Now, the consequences would begin. I slipped out of the banquet hall, the noise of laughter and clinking glasses muffled as the heavy doors closed behind me. The corridor was quiet, lined with paintings of vineyards and photographs of the estate. I leaned against the wall, feeling the cool stone against my back as I drew in a long, steadying breath. My suit was stiff with dried wine, and I looked down at the stain like it was a wound carved into the fabric. It wasn't just clothing ruined, it was dignity. And if I walked out of that building without saying a word, the stain wouldn't remain only on my chest. It would linger on my name, my memory, my place as a father. For years, I had lived by the belief that silence was strength, that letting things go made you the bigger man. I thought patience was noble, but patience tonight had only made me invisible. My silence had turned me into an accessory to my own humiliation. I could almost hear my late wife's voice whispering in the back of my mind, "Don't let him forget who you are." Footsteps approached. I turned and saw Mr. Halpern, an old friend of the family, one of the few who had known me since my early days working in the shop. His hair was silver now, but his eyes were sharp, full of the same steadiness I remembered from years ago when he had helped me find my first big carpentry contract. He studied me for a moment, his gaze falling on the stain across my shirt. "David," he said quietly, "you don't deserve that." I tried to brush it off, forcing a weak smile. It's his wedding. Let him have his fun. But Halpern shook his head, firm. That wasn't fun. That was cruelty. Everyone saw it. Don't let them walk away thinking that's the truth of you. His words hit me like a hammer against steel, shaping my resolve. I realized then that silence would no longer do. If I left things as they were, Ethan's story would become the only story. He would walk away believing that his father was nothing more than a punchline, and worse, the world would believe it too. I straightened, pressing my palm against the pocket where my father's watch rested, the metal steady against my skin. That watch had seen generations of men who worked, endured, and built lives with their hands. I would not let its legacy end with shame. When I returned to the hall, the air changed. Perhaps it was only in my perception, but I felt the room's murmur falter, eyes shifting toward me, as if they could sense I carried something different now. My steps were measured, deliberate, as I walked back to my seat. Ethan glanced up, a smirk tugging at his lips, but it faltered quickly when he caught my expression. I didn't sit. Instead, I reached for the microphone that lay on the stand near the band. My hand was steady as I lifted it, though inside my chest my heart beat like a drum. Conversations died instantly, glasses were lowered, even the band fell silent. I looked around the room, meeting eyes one by one. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, I began, my voice even, calm. But since my name has been brought up so often, perhaps it's time I do. A ripple moved through the crowd. Ethan shifted in his seat, his face tightening. I continued. My son is right about one thing. I did spend my life in a garage, in workshops, in sawdust and sweat. I worked with my hands because that's what I knew, and because it was the only way I could give him the life he deserved. Every morning, before sunrise, I walked into that shop and stayed until my hands bled, so he could go to schools I never dreamed of, so he could wear suits I could never afford. The room was silent now, the weight of my words heavier than any laughter could erase. Some guests lowered their heads, others stared, unblinking. I held the microphone tighter, letting my gaze land on Ethan. I may not belong in rooms like this. I may not understand wine lists or polished silver, but I know sacrifice. I know what it means to give until there's nothing left, and to do it without asking for applause. That's what fathers do. And maybe one day, when he has children of his own, my son will understand what that means. A hush fell so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped. Ethan's face was pale, his smile completely gone. He shifted in his chair, trying to muster a response, but the words stuck in his throat. The crowd, once amused, now sat in uneasy silence. I set the microphone back down gently. I didn't need applause, I didn't need cheers. All I needed was the truth, spoken clearly in front of the same witnesses who had watched me be humiliated. And the truth had landed. As I returned to my seat, I felt lighter, steadier. For the first time that night, I wasn't carrying the weight of silence. I had reclaimed my voice, and with it, a piece of the dignity that had nearly been stripped away. If you're still watching and the aftermath has you reflecting, share a number 8 in the comments, so I know you're right here with me. Let's continue this journey. When I lowered the microphone and returned to my seat, the room felt utterly changed. It wasn't just quieter, it was heavy, like the air itself carried the weight of truth. The same chandeliers that had gleamed with laughter earlier now seemed to cast a colder, more revealing light. I sat down slowly, adjusting my stained jacket with deliberate care, and let the silence linger. No one laughed. No one dared. Where moments before I had been a punchline, now the hall was filled with unease, shame, and something I hadn't felt all night: respect. I saw it in the eyes of a few guests who nodded subtly, their lips pressed tight as if silently apologizing. Others turned away, ashamed to meet my gaze. The ripple of change had begun. Ethan sat frozen at the head table. The smirk he had worn so easily throughout the evening was gone. His face was pale, his jaw tight. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, the dawning realization that his attempt to impress this polished crowd had backfired. For the first time that night, he looked small, not because of me, but because of himself. Avery shifted beside him, her hands slipping from his. Her eyes, once radiant with the glow of a bride, now narrowed in disappointment. I saw the faintest shake of her head as she turned away from him. It was not my voice alone that had changed the room. It was the truth that could not be laughed away. The Whitakers, Avery's parents, sat stiff and silent. Her father glanced at me briefly, his lips parting as if he might speak, but he didn't. He only adjusted his tie, uncomfortable, as though unsure whether to acknowledge me or to retreat further into silence. The band, unsure of what to do, plucked at their instruments lightly, but no one paid them attention. Conversations remained hushed, eyes darted nervously, and the energy of celebration had fractured. I had not intended to ruin the reception, but I knew with certainty that I could not leave the night as it had been. Dignity demanded its due, and now it had been paid. I didn't rise again. I didn't deliver a second speech or seek applause. I had no need for validation. The silence that followed my words was louder than any ovation could ever be. The respect reclaimed in those minutes was enough. I looked once more at Ethan. His eyes flicked to mine, then quickly away, shame etched across his features. He reached for his wine glass but set it down untouched. I knew then that he had heard me, truly heard me, even if his pride wouldn't yet allow him to admit it. I stood. Slowly, calmly, I pushed back my chair. A few heads turned, a few whispers rustled across the tables. I didn't need to explain. With one last look around the hall, I offered a small, courteous nod. "Thank you for the evening," I said softly, my voice steady enough that those nearest me could hear. And then I walked away. I passed through the wide doors, out into the cool night air. The vineyard stretched in the distance, rows of vines silhouetted against the faint light of the moon. I inhaled deeply, the fresh air washing away the taste of bitterness that had clung to me all night. For the first time since the reception began, I felt light, unburdened. Inside, the wedding would continue, though never as it had before. The guests would eat and dance, but they would also remember the moment when the laughter stopped. They would remember that the man in the stained suit had stood taller than any insult thrown at him. As I walked toward my car, I didn't know what the future of my relationship with Ethan would be. Perhaps there would be reconciliation, perhaps only distance. That was a question for another time. What mattered now was that I had not left my dignity on the floor of that banquet hall. I had carried it out with me, intact, stronger than before. The night air was cool against my face, and I let the silence of the vineyard embrace me. The wedding behind me would fade into memory, but my choice, my refusal to be erased, would remain. I drove away quietly, leaving the glow of chandeliers behind, knowing that whatever came next, I had taken back what mattered most: my voice, my respect, and the truth of who I was. There are moments in life that carve themselves into your memory so deeply that no amount of time can erase them. The night of my son's wedding is one of those moments. I still feel the sting of humiliation when his words echoed through the ballroom, and the shock of cold wine as it hit my face in front of everyone. But when I look back now, I don't see it as the end of something. I see it as the beginning. That night forced me to claim what I had allowed others to diminish for too long: my own dignity. For years, I had lived in a quiet truce with disrespect. I told myself that silence was safer than conflict, that letting cruel remarks pass unchallenged was better than breaking the fragile bond between father and son. I endured the jokes, the dismissive glances, and the subtle ways I was treated as less than enough. I believed, as many fathers do, that one day my son would see me clearly, and that recognition would be worth all the years of waiting. But I learned that waiting for validation is a prison built from your own patience. What happened that night didn't destroy me. It freed me. When Ethan mocked me in front of his new family, I felt something inside shift. For once, I did not retreat into silence or swallow the insult to keep the peace. I stood firm, I spoke, and I refused to let my dignity be purchased at the cost of someone else's entertainment. In that moment, I learned that respect is not something you beg for. It is something you command by refusing to surrender it. As I left the reception hall, I realized that this wasn't just about a single cruel sentence or a glass of spilled wine. It was about decades of small cuts that had been allowed to shape me. It was about parking lot jokes that were brushed off as harmless, dinner table remarks meant to sting, and the silence I had kept so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. All those moments had been training for this one, and when it came, I discovered that I could finally carry myself without shame. Fatherhood is complicated. We raise our children hoping they'll inherit the best of us, and when they don't, we often blame ourselves. But I have come to understand something important. We cannot control the hearts of our children. We can guide, we can provide, we can love, but we cannot make them see us the way we wish to be seen. Waiting for that day can waste a lifetime. What we can do, however, is define ourselves, honor ourselves, and demand that others meet us at that level. The lesson of that night goes beyond fathers and sons. It is about the power of words. A cruel sentence spoken in public can scar a person for decades. Too many people laugh along with such words, thinking they are harmless, not realizing they are accomplices in someone else's pain. But the opposite is true as well. A single sentence of truth, spoken with conviction, can restore what was stolen. It can silence mockery and turn shame into respect. So, what do I carry forward from that evening? Not bitterness, not revenge. What I carry is clarity. The clarity that my worth is not tethered to the opinions of others, not even to my own sons. The clarity that respect, once claimed, cannot be taken back by laughter or derision. The clarity that the greatest revenge is not shouting louder or striking back, but living in a way that makes mockery look small. I do not know if Ethan and I will ever find our way back to each other. That is his choice as much as mine. But I no longer wait for his approval to steady me. I no longer hold my breath for a word of praise that may never come. Instead, I breathe fully, knowing that my life is defined by what I choose to stand for. And if you, reading this, have ever been mocked or dismissed, hear me clearly. You are not defined by the laughter of the room. You are defined by the truth you carry, the way you stand, and the dignity you refuse to abandon. Words can wound, yes, but words can also heal. And sometimes, the word that heals is the one you say to yourself, enough. I left that wedding not as a broken man, but as a man finally whole. And if there is one message I want to leave behind, it is this. The greatest revenge is not in the spectacle of humiliation or the silence of bitterness. The greatest revenge is living with honor so steadfast that others have no choice but to adjust their measure of you. That night, I walked away not as the butt of a cruel joke, but as a man who had finally reclaimed his name. In the quiet after every storm, there is always a choice, to carry the bitterness forward or to let the weight fall and walk lighter into the next day. Life has a way of testing dignity in public spaces, often when the heart is most vulnerable. The words that wound the deepest are not always shouted. They are often spoken with a smirk, disguised as jokes, or echoed by silence that fails to defend. Yet in those moments of exposure, there lies an opportunity to claim something far greater than approval, the right to stand firm in one's own worth. The truth is that respect is never guaranteed by bloodlines, traditions, or social titles. It is earned by how we carry ourselves, how we endure, and how we choose to respond when someone tries to shrink us. Silence can be survival for a time, but there comes a day when silence must break, when dignity must speak, not through anger, but through steadiness and clarity. That is when the balance shifts, when cruelty is stripped of its audience and the weight of truth begins to fill the room. The lesson is not simply about defiance. It is about the quiet strength of knowing who you are, even when others refuse to see it. It is about refusing to allow someone else's careless words to define the measure of your life. And it is about recognizing that sometimes the most powerful response is not revenge or humiliation, but a simple, unwavering refusal to surrender your dignity. Every generation faces the question of how to treat those closest to them, with respect or with ridicule, with love or with dismissal. The answer shapes not only families, but entire communities. Words can fracture bonds for decades, but they can also heal in an instant, if chosen with care. To live with integrity is to understand that the smallest phrase, the quietest acknowledgement, can restore hope where once there was only hurt. In the end, the deepest victories are not loud or dramatic. They are lived in the way one walks away with their head held high, the way truth lingers long after the laughter has faded, and the way dignity, once reclaimed, becomes unshakable. These turning points remind us that setting boundaries and valuing ourselves is not just an act of courage. It's the foundation of living with dignity. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's one lesson from this story that you feel connected to, and how will you apply it in your own life? Let's grow together by sharing our thoughts. If this story resonated with you, drop a 1 in the comments. If not, feel free to leave a 0. Your feedback helps us improve. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark reflection. Thank you for watching, and here's to living life with strength, honesty, and authenticity.